listener is, are these news sources truthful and accurate? To answer this question, we need to go back about 11 years. In 1997, reporter Jane Aker and her husband, Steve Wilson, were working on an investigative story for WTVT Channel 13 in Tampa, Florida. Their story showed that most dairy farmers were injecting their milk cows with a controversial bovine growth hormone, RBGH, so that the cows would produce more milk. Their investigations found out that Monsanto was a major producer of this hormone. This hormone allowed the cows to produce up to 33% more milk, but it also caused problems. The results of their investigations were rather damning. Unfortunately, Monsanto was a major advertiser for Fox and did not want the story broadcast. Aker rewrote the story 83 times, with each version being sent to Monsanto lawyers for approval. Finally, the Fox News administrator directed Aker to lie on television, which she refused to do, and for which she was fired. Aker and Wilson filed a lawsuit under the Florida Private Whistleblowers Act against Fox Television and were awarded $425,000 on August 18, 2000. After the ruling, McDaniels, an attorney for Fox, told the judge to overturn this ruling because, according to the FCC, quote, there is no law, rule, or regulation against slanting the news, end quote. Apparently, Fox News thinks there's nothing wrong with purposely misleading the public with a newscast. This is the ultimate irony. The main reason people watch the news is to learn the truth, but the Fox attorney says it's okay to purposely mislead the public. Let's go ahead to February 14, 2003. Fox, now on its fourth judge and law case, finally gets a Florida appeals court ruling that there is absolutely nothing illegal in a major media organization lying, concealing, or distorting information. The attorneys for Fox, owned by Australian Rupert Murdoch, argued that the First Amendment gives broadcasters the right to lie or deliberately distort news reports on the public airwaves. In a 6-page written decision, the court stated that the Federal Communications Commission's position against news distortion is only a, quote, policy, end quote, not a law, rule, or regulation. This is phenomenal. What is ironic and amazing here is that this may be the biggest story of 2003, and the New York Times writes almost nothing about it. If the media does not think an appeals court ruling that there is nothing illegal about a professional news organization deliberately broadcasting lies to the public is newsworthy, then what is? Perhaps a better way to see media and American government propaganda is how the media reports our mistakes versus other countries making the same types of mistakes. For example, on September 1, 1983, a Soviet jet interceptor shot down the Korean airliner KAL-007. All 269 people were killed. The New York Times, our most prestigious propaganda source, lambasted the Soviet Union mercilessly on September 2nd. Here are some of the major headlines in that issue. 1. President denounces wanton act. 2. Horrifying act of violence. 3. Angry Schultz says he can see no excuse. 4. A barbarous act, South Korea says. 5. The editorial was titled Murder in the Air. On July 3, 1988, the United States naval cruiser Vincennes shot down an Iranian airliner, Iran Air 655. All 290 people aboard were killed, but the New York Times on July 4th and 5th reversed every critical statement they blasted the Russians with less than 5 years earlier, and basically stated it was Iran's fault for not telling us they were flying over their own waters. Here are some of the major headlines in those issues. 1. U.S. downs Iran airliner mistaken for F-14. 290 reported dead. A tragedy. Reagan says action is defended. 2. Failure seen in safeguard on erroneous attack. 3. Statement by Joint Chiefs Chairman, U.S. deeply regrets this incident. 4. Iran calls U.S. action a barbaric massacre. 5. No policy changes in the Gulf as a result, State Department says. 6. A saddened President Reagan remains at Camp David. 7. U.S. denies any similarities with KAL-007. 8. Great sensitivity to comparisons with KAL-007. 9. Military errors, the snafu as history. 10. U.S. skipper, we will defend ourselves. 11. Is it a bird or is it a plane? Radar may not know. 12. Downing of jet raises questions on schedules. 13. Reagan, hinting no policy shift, sees understandable accident. And 14. The editorial was titled In Captain Rogers' Shoes. It is clear from the first listing of headlines that the Soviet Union did something not only horrible, but also deserving of condemnation and outright insults. It is also clear that they had no excuse for such monstrous behavior. In fact, the first sentence in the Murder in the Air editorial is, "There is no conceivable excuse for any nation shooting down a harmless airliner." End quote. 5 years later, the United States Navy shoots down a, quote, harmless airliner. But this time, not only was there an excuse, it was an, quote, understandable accident, end quote. Out of 14 major articles, only one was negative to the United States. Evidently that seemed balanced to the editors, even though most of the articles were decidedly negative 5 years earlier against the Russians, who did the same thing. These articles are a good study in misdirection and general propaganda. It's tragic, our president says, and he's sad. That was certainly important for the New York Times to tell us. Obviously, the Soviets had no human feelings when they shot down KAL 007. There are several articles on policy, but evidently the policy was fine. My favorite article is 11. Is it a bird or is it a plane? Radar may not know. That damned newfangled radar just can't be trusted. Even though the Vincennes had the newest electronic countermeasures of any warship. I guess a low-bid contractor put in their radar. They tried to contact the Iranian airliner by radio and got no response. Their assessment was to assume the worst and prepare to down it, which they did 6 minutes later. They assumed it to be an F-14, which is a formidable warplane containing missiles. The only trouble with this assessment was, 1. The unknown plane was only flying 500 miles per hour, whereas an F-14 can go over 1,500 miles per hour. 2. The plane leisurely cruised up to 9,000 feet. And 3. The plane was flying in a standard commercial air corridor between the Bandar Abbas Airport in Iran and Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. If an F-14 was going to attack them, then this behavior would be very unorthodox. To fly so slowly and to expose yourself so clearly to a modern warship that you are presumably planning to attack would be to invite self-destruction. In any event, it is good to know that we Americans are not really at fault. As the New York Times editorial in Captain Rogers' Shoes pointed out, it was nonetheless an accident, and we all know stuff happens. The editorial goes on to point out that it is too early to assess blame, and this episode also raises stern questions for Iran. After reading that editorial, one would think that the Iranians should thank us for shooting down their plane and showing that they have to monitor their in-flight radio better. Perhaps Iran should apologize to Captain Rogers, because according to the editorial, no one would have to be in Captain Rogers' shoes in the first place. I do have to agree with the New York Times about not showing similarities with the reasons for the Soviets shooting down KAL 007. There really aren't any. The shooting down of KAL 007 was justified according to ethics between powerful nations. KAL 007 was 400 miles off course, flying over restricted Soviet airspace and dangerously close to a naval base. The Iranian airliner, according to the New York Times, might have been as much as 5 miles outside the commercial corridor, but this is easily done when you consider that the plane was flying 500 miles per hour and had recently taken off from the airport. The Iranians, however, had stated that their plane was flying in the commercial corridor. To sum up, the Soviets had a good case for espionage, but the United States appears to have a navy that doesn't train well for something as common as commercial airliners flying regularly scheduled flights in their airspace over their own waters that our navy routinely patrols. In any event, the deliberate misleading of the public by news services is not a new occurrence. Here is a quote by a very successful past senior editor of the New York Times. Quote, There is no such thing at this date of the world's history as an independent press. You know it and I know it. There is not one of you who dares to write their honest opinions, and if you did,